UX questions. Your user experience questions answered in 3 minutes or less.
Hey, it's Ben Judy. Welcome to UX Questions Special Number 1, Inclusive Design Strategy. This is a special episode of UX Questions. It's going to be longer than 3 minutes by just a little bit. I teach a workshop about how to form a strategy for inclusive design that you can use in your organization. Now, I usually do this workshop at conferences like UX Strat or within organizations as a consultant. It usually takes half a day to a full day. There's lots of material and lots of interactive exercises. Participants in my workshop actually create a set of strategy documents that they can then put into action. In this video, I will not teach the full workshop, but I will present some of the introductory material from the beginning of the workshop, in which I give an overview of inclusive design. After that, I'll give a quick overview of the strategy framework. Without further ado, here is UX Questions Special Number 1, Inclusive Design Strategy. Hi, I'm Ben Judy. I'm delighted to speak with you today about inclusive design strategy. I'll introduce myself quickly. If you want to look me up online, there aren't many Ben Judys out there, so I'm not hard to find. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want. I welcome that. Here's my career timeline that shows various job titles I've held, brands I've worked for, and industries I've designed for. And I started working in web design in 1999. I became a UX designer, then a UX manager and director. Over the years, I've held pretty much every UX-related job title. Currently, I'm a senior manager at the Home Depot, leading our enterprise UX design operations team, which I love because I get to help UX designers throughout the organization be more efficient and increase the quality of design outcomes. I also mentor people entering the UX career field through a boot camp called Design Lab. And I host a video channel and podcast called UX Questions, where twice each week I answer a common question about user experience in 3 minutes or less. I publish these short episodes every Monday and Thursday. You can submit your UX question at uxquestions.com, and I will answer it on the show in a future episode. Okay, let's get into this topic. I teach a workshop about how to form a strategy for inclusive design that you can use in your organization. Now, in this presentation, I won't teach the full workshop. This is just going to be a sort of condensed version of some of the content that I teach, but I'll give you a quick overview of the strategy framework. And by the way, I'm going to mention a lot of articles and resources, and links to all the things I'm referencing are in this slide deck. You can get this slide deck at bit.ly/idstrat if you later want to look at something that I mention. So here's what I'm prepared to talk about. I'll define what inclusive design is, just to make sure we're starting from the same place with the same definitions. Then I'll talk about why it matters to us as UX practitioners. I'll cover a few inclusive design principles. Then I'll give you an overview of my strategy framework, how to create an inclusive design strategy. Now, when I teach the workshop, I give it this title, the Inclusive Design Strategy Bake-Off. And I have a cake-related theme because who doesn't love cake? There are about a zillion of these cooking TV shows on the streaming services, all sorts of shows where contestants bake tasty things. Top Chef and the Great British Baking Show and Is It Cake and all the rest. The metaphor is we're baking a strategy like we would bake a cake if we were on one of these shows. Anyway, you'll notice a cake-related theme when I get to the strategy framework. That's why I use this as a metaphor when I teach the full workshop. Apologies if the cake imagery throughout my slide deck makes you hungry for cake. So, what is inclusive design? Let's start with some terminology. You hear these terms, DEIA, IDEA, DEIB. What are we talking about? There's every possible combination of acronyms made out of these words. Diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging, race, justice. It's like alphabet soup, all these acronyms. I like JEDI. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. You knew the Star Wars fans were going to get in on this. May the inclusive force be with you. But my inner information architect and content strategist really wants me to be precise with language here. So let's tease apart the differences between these terms. Let's start with diversity. What do we mean when we say diversity? I'm just going to define it as how people are different. You can get more nuanced, but I feel like that's pretty much what it boils down to. There's a frequently quoted research paper by Hong and Page, published in 2004 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they defined diversity as differences in demographic characteristics, cultural identities, and ethnicity, and training and expertise. That's a list of diversity factors, right? Demographics, cultural identities, ethnicity, training, and expertise. But as UX practitioners, we know there are many, many more diversity factors that we might study. Maze, the product discovery software platform, has a good list of categories of diversity: culture and customs, age, income, education, and so forth. Diet is one that I thought was unusual. What your users are accustomed to eating is a diversity factor that may or may not be important, depending on the nature of the software you're designing and how it will be used. Lydia Hooper has a warning worth considering. She says, don't use the word diverse to refer to people who are different from what might be considered normal or dominant. So that's a helpful perspective. It's not that what I'm used to is normal and your whole thing is diverse. That's a very me-centric view of the world, and it's a very non-empathetic mindset. The book Moments of Impact by Chris Ertl and Lisa K. Solomon is not a book primarily about diversity, but they do talk about a diversity of diversities. The psychological diversity category is an interesting one. Personality types, learning styles, value systems, motivations. But the authors of that book say you can't possibly take into account, less optimize for, all the possible combinations of these perspectives. Thankfully, you don't need to. Your purpose isn't to gather a Noah's Ark of token representation. It's to find creative and effective solutions to real challenges. I think that's a strategic way to think about diversity. You're making a choice. Which diversity factors are you going to strategically design for? How will you achieve goals or outcomes for your company by intentionally narrowing focus to a few specific diversity factors? Okay, what about equity? How would you define equity in relation to UX or product design? Often when we talk about being equitable in our design efforts, we're taking those identity diversity factors and we're looking at people who have been marginalized or overlooked. Vidya Raghavani says, the goal here is to uplift the traditionally underrepresented communities while keeping in mind their needs and goals. UXspot.io says, the goal of equity-focused design is to promote groups that have been excluded in the past. The Interaction Design Foundation has a good article on equity theory. Now, this is a different use of the word equity among UX people. It's not exactly about designing for people who are overlooked or underrepresented. This is about the value exchange between an employee and an employer, or the cost-benefit equation between a user of a system and the providers or owners of that system. So I just mention it because when you hear UX people talking about equity, you have to make sure you understand their use of the word. See, there's also another use of the word equity that has nothing to do with caring about people. If you go to uxequity.com, you can learn all about helping your brand earn greater volume and greater margins. In other words, how to make more money through better UX design. Fair enough, equity is a financial term too, but that's not really related to inclusive design. Not only is the website devoid of any content related to human-centered equity design, it's also inaccessible. I can barely read that white text over the image on the homepage. Oh, the irony that you would go to uxequity.com and it fails at basic accessibility. I guess this is what happens when your focus is entirely on financial gain. So just be aware. Some people will use the term design equity differently while failing to actually practice equitable design. A closely related term to equity is justice. David Dillon Thomas says, design justice thinks about the power aspects of design. It assumes that you're always making a choice and you're going to optimize your design for one group over another. So it's about being conscious of those choices. That kind of echoes what we saw earlier when we looked at perspectives on diversity. You have to choose who you're going to prioritize in your design effort. And the design justice mindset would say, ignoring the power dynamics that lead to injustice toward a group of people is not passive. It's actively making a bad choice. You're choosing to allow your biases to guide you toward designing for one group over another. And there's much more to be said about that. But what about accessibility? Well, that's about ensuring that interfaces and technology can be used by people with disabilities. And I'm going to talk more about that word disabilities in the next section. We'll come back to that. And then there's universal design. Now, there is a pretty standard definition of universal design, which is about a single product design being usable by all people without the need for adaptation or specialized design. But how is inclusive design different from these other terms? We haven't defined it yet. We've just looked at definitions of diversity, equity, design justice, accessibility, and universal design. But what is inclusive design? Well, we have lots of definitions. One is inclusive design is a methodology that considers the full range of human diversity to deliver experiences that are usable and open to all. That's from Mays. Microsoft defines it as a design methodology that enables and draws on the full range of human diversity. So interesting that both are using the word diversity here. Sometimes it's helpful to compare terms and look at how they are opposite or different from each other. Let's compare inclusive design to accessibility. Now, these are not at odds with each other. They work very well hand in hand, but a direct comparison can help us be more careful and specific when we use these words. They're not interchangeable terms. I'll just highlight a few differences. Inclusive design is process-based, while accessibility is outcome-based. See, just making an effort to be more inclusive is the goal of inclusive design. It's about the journey, not a destination. And we don't need to measure progress toward a clearly defined set of outcomes like we do with accessibility. There are measurable attributes of a product that can tell us how accessible it is. Inclusive design aims for better, not complete, but accessibility aims for compliance with a set of standards or passing a test. For example, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, or Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 in the US. You can use checklists and automated tools to help you measure accessibility and get a passing score. Not so much with inclusive design, it's squishier. It's less about usability and more about how people feel, that feeling of belonging, helping everyone feel like this product was made for me. Both inclusive design and accessibility solve for human needs and how we are diverse, how we're different. It's just a slightly different focus. We can also quickly compare inclusive design to universal design. Inclusive design has no generally agreed upon definition. I gave you a couple definitions a few slides ago, but you can find others with different words. Universal design, however, does have a generally agreed upon academic definition. It's the one I read earlier, and it comes from North Carolina State University, the Center for Universal Design. So with inclusive design, the mindset tends to be that alternate designs or alternate paths for users are encouraged. You can create design A for this user group and design B for this other user group. Whereas universal design says you shall make no alternatives in the product design based on human differences. It's that lack of accommodation via designed alternatives that is the difference. And many people have observed that this is an impossible goal. You can't actually create a single design that will work for every human being. But universal design would say you try to make that one universally usable design to the greatest extent possible. Okay, thanks for hanging in there through those definitions, but I think it's important to ground ourselves in what we're talking about. Now let's consider, why does inclusive design matter to UX practitioners? The US Digital Service published a quick guide to inclusive design and said, inclusive design is just good design. It's just what UX practitioners have been doing all along, applied to everyone. When you start looking at inclusive design practices, you discover that a lot of it has to do with introducing design constraints. It's a lot of what about? What about users who can't do X, Y, and Z? What about users who expect A, B, and C? Solving for those what abouts introduces design constraints. And Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit says designing with constraints is simply designing well. So there's this idea that if we're doing human-centered or user-centered design, and we're doing it well, we're going to be more inclusive. Now, from a business perspective, there are a lot of reasons why we expect a focus on inclusion to help us achieve our goals. Google sponsored a study published by Harvard Business Review. It's called Product Inclusion: Building Better User Experiences and Business Growth. Essentially, the study showed that business leaders expect a wide array of business benefits to come from a focus on inclusive design for products. They surveyed business leaders who said, a focus on product inclusion would help you provide the right features in product offerings and increase relevance in diverse markets, and so forth. And this was about 5 years ago. I suspect the percentage of leaders who expect these benefits is higher now. This is trending upward. So there's a profit motive that can be talked about as a rationale for investing in inclusive design. It's similar to how investing in usability equals reduced risk and a product that people love, which translates into business value. UX practitioners are familiar with this, right? Human Factors International, Nielsen Norman Group, and all the rest have been helping us make the business case for usability and UX design for at least a couple decades, right? There's an ROI expectation for usability, and there's an ROI expectation for inclusive design. I once worked at a software agency that pitched to a prospective client who had this in their RFP document. We're committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion because we believe companies are much more likely to outperform peers with a diverse leadership team. Now, that speaks to their hiring practices for leadership positions. But as we talked with the CEO of this company, we discovered that she felt the same about the design process for the software itself. Business leaders have come to expect that a focus on inclusive product design will ultimately lead to greater profit. It wasn't always this way. Have you heard the old story about Kodak? This is an often repeated story, so I'm sure some of you have heard it before. My apologies if you have. But basically, Kodak sold a printer for independent photo labs, and to make sure that the colors and densities of the prints were calibrated correctly, Kodak sent a kit with color prints and original unexposed negatives. Each color print was an original shot of this woman on the right here, Shirley Page, who was a model. The Shirley cards, as they were called, were used all over the world, wherever Kodak printers were sold. Over the decades, Kodak always used a white female model for calibrating their photo printers because Kodak product and business leaders thought an image of a person who looked like Shirley would help provide a quote-unquote normal skin tone for their customers. Of course, this led to horribly skewed color balance in photos of anyone who didn't have Shirley's skin tone. Kodak eventually recognized this error and included a variety of skin tones in their calibration kit, so the Shirley cards became more diverse. But it's now a classic story of the problems that result from unchecked bias and how to not be inclusive in product design. And we see all sorts of failures of inclusive design in the world of software design and development. Algorithmic photo checkers consistently determined that an Asian subject's eyes are closed even though his eyes are clearly opened. Speech-to-text tools misunderstood and therefore mistranscribed black speakers nearly twice as often as white speakers. And you may have seen similar headlines and quite possibly have experienced these kinds of problems as a user, where the designers of the software assumed everyone using their product was like them in some regard or another, and they didn't include a diverse user group in their design and testing process. Now, being charitable, you could assume best intent. You could look at these stories, and there are many of them, and you could assume that the people who created this software were just blind to their own biases, as we all are, and they just didn't try hard enough to be inclusive in their design efforts. Again, that's assuming best intent. Maybe they didn't mean for the software to fail so spectacularly, but then sometimes people do things very much on purpose that are, let's just say, questionable. 3 former Stanford students created a startup and received funding to produce software that makes call center employees in India sound like they have a white American accent. It does speech-to-text transcription, and then it reads it back according to the article in, and I quote, a passable white and American-sounding voice, albeit a bit robotic. Basically, it's a real-time voice deepfake. This is where inclusive design efforts get weird. See, from a certain point of view, this is well-intentioned. This is to help those Indian call center employees be better understood, and it's to help the people they're calling to better understand. It's just helping people communicate. Or is that all it is? I have questions about the ethical implications when I read stories like this. On a more positive note, when we talk about accessibility, we know that things created specifically for people with disabilities often end up being valuable to many more people. Human-centered design is good for all of us, right? BT, British Telecom, made a phone with bigger buttons for people who are permanently visually impaired. So it's not universal design for the phone, but is a good example of accommodation or specialized inclusive design. Well, surprise, a lot of people with strong visual acuity loved this phone because it's just easier to use. Bigger buttons are better for everyone. And there are temporary reductions in ability. With my glasses on, I can use a small number pad, but glasses off, I would do a lot better with bigger buttons. There are motor control issues and people wearing gloves and all kinds of situations where this is a better experience. This is similar to how in web design, a mobile-first responsive design approach often leads to better desktop design as well. But disability is not the edge case we often think it is. 1 in 4 U.S. adults have a disability that impacts major life activities. 25% of us. That is not a small number. And I have a confession to make. I'll be honest with you. I see that number and I'm surprised. I don't expect it to be that large a percentage. It's my own unintentional bias that prevents me from being more inclusive as a designer. And of course, we all have disabilities on a situational basis. Let's say you have shoulder surgery and your arm is in a sling for a couple months, you can't type, and so forth. So we're thinking about why this topic matters to UX practitioners. Let's think about some of the common methods that we use as user researchers and designers. I have a provocative question for you. What's wrong with user personas? Have you ever created or used a persona or user archetype in your design process? This is the way UX practitioners have been taught for decades now, to create a profile of a representative user. You do some user research, a little qual, a little quant. You create this artifact that represents a typical user or an average user. And this artifact has information such as age, gender, family living situation, employment status, needs and goals in relation to your product. Maybe you include a quote that you heard a user say in your research. Does this look familiar? Here's the problem with this persona. If I'm the designer, it tells me a lot of specific things, and that specificity is often unnecessary and biasing in ways that aren't good. The photo image of this user tells me that she's white, she's female, and she wears a hat. So if any of my users are not white, not female, or dislike wearing hats, I wouldn't know it from this persona. The persona tells me she loves outdoor activities such as hiking, mountain biking, rock climbing. Well, good for her. If any of my users use a wheelchair or have limited mobility, I'm encouraged to dismiss or overlook them. This is not a normal user if they're not like her. And I love this. Our frustrations include sometimes hosts do not speak proper English. Oh my gosh, she's the person on the other end of the phone from the India call center. We found her. This persona is from a 6-month UX bootcamp. And for a little over $5,000, they will teach you to make a persona like this. And I'm not picking on them. The way they teach personas is in line with exactly the way all of us who are UX designers learned how to build empathy for our users. But folks, this is a Kodak Shirley card. Only much, much worse, because a UX researcher or UX designer created it with the intent that it would help us empathize with our users. It's bias masquerading as empathy. Now you could say, well, that's why we don't just make one, we make multiple personas to cover the spectrum of human difference. But the problem with that is you can't make enough. Have you ever made more than 5 or 6 personas and tried to use them with your product team? There's a point of diminishing returns. And this is the conundrum of inclusive design. I said earlier, you have to make a choice. You choose to make these specific personas based on research because you can't really design universally. But personas with these kinds of specific diversity factors introduce and reinforce bias towards certain human qualities, and they invalidate or ignore other human qualities. We might say people are marginalized by personas. It's inevitable. Margaret Price is one of the UX leaders who's been saying for a few years now, we need to reinvent them to be more inclusive. Margaret says the more human we try to make personas by adding specific personality traits and details about habits, the more we unconsciously stereotype people, and this is dangerous. So in fact, she helped Microsoft reinvent personas to something called persona spectrums. And I encourage you to look into persona spectrums. They're a good example of new, more inclusive approaches to traditional UX work. The great problem of inclusive design is bias. We all have biases. It's impossible not to. Inclusive design matters to designers because we're human. Therefore, we're all biased. And our biases often prevent us from designing great experiences for people. In fact, we bake our biases into our UX design process with artifacts like personas, and we pat ourselves on the back for being empathetic. Ouch. Well, the Cognitive Bias Codex is an amazing resource. Exploring this is a great starting point for understanding the depth and complexity of our biases. A really good activity for your design team is to have everyone pick a part of the wheel of the Cognitive Bias Codex. Go read the articles and think about where these biases might come into play in your design process, and then have a group discussion about it. You'll learn a ton, and you might make some healthy changes in how you design. So by now, we're all starting to realize how complex and multifaceted this topic of inclusive design really is. What are some principles that we can pick up and apply to help us fight against conscious or unconscious bias and to design more inclusively? The Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, PEAT, has a list of 7 principles of inclusive design. And what I noticed is they read a lot like Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics, which I assume most of us are familiar with. There's actually a lot of good overlap between principles for inclusive design and just the basic received wisdom for UX designers that we've heard for several decades now. Some of our methods may need tweaking, like personas, but the alignment at a foundational principle level is there. Here's a small sample of principles of inclusive design from various organizations. I won't read all of these, but let's just look at Microsoft, for example. Recognize exclusion, solve for one, extend to many, and learn from diversity. And we have inclusive design principles from organizations like Airbnb, Adobe, TPGI, the Design Council of the UK government. It's interesting to compare these, but I'll let you do that later. On to the final thing that I want to share with you, which is my framework for creating an inclusive design strategy. How can I create an inclusive design strategy? When you search the web for inclusive design strategy, you'll mostly find articles about accessibility. Use this accessibility checklist, use that technique, do this with ARIA tags in your HTML, and that's all great stuff, but it's tactical, not strategic. Here's an example. The Bureau of Internet Accessibility, a consulting company, has this article, 5 Strategies for Creating an Inclusive Design. And I found this article and I thought, great, I'll just read this article and it will tell me how to strategize in 5 easy steps. And their strategies include advice like use color carefully, with specific tips about using color to convey meaning and some discussion of WCAG level AA requirements for color contrast. Now, would your business leaders regard use color carefully as a strategic goal? Would you make this a cornerstone of a strategy document? I don't think so. It's just a thing you go do, and you should do it. But with apologies to the Bureau of Internet Accessibility, this is not a strategy for inclusive design. How do you make a compelling case to an executive leader in your company that they should sponsor your efforts to do something new and different and invest in inclusive design? Creating strategy for inclusive design requires asking some questions that are really hard to answer. How much of the company's time, effort, and money should we spend checking our biases? How do we measure that we've sufficiently checked our biases so we don't overinvest? If I want to have a strategic conversation with my boss about doing something new, these are the kinds of questions I must be able to answer. What business advantage will result from increased focus on inclusive design? Executives have a general expectation of ROI, but your strategy has to be specific and convincing. Can I create a testable hypothesis and pilot new solutions or approaches? There isn't a good framework for answering these questions and creating a solid strategy document. I couldn't find one. So I made this workshop and I created a framework. And yeah, I'm using that baking show, that cake competition metaphor to make it fun. But if you focus on the right side of this slide, these are the 6 steps to creating an inclusive design strategy. First, you define the organizational context. Write down your missions, your goals, your competitive landscape, your opportunities and constraints. Second, you place some big bets. You decide on what to emphasize in your inclusive design strategy. You help your team decide what particular aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, etc. are the most important elements, because you can't do it all at once. Third, you state your desired outcomes. You're aiming for measurable results, key performance indicators. What will it look like to serve your end users better, to make your organization more effective, more successful, maybe more ethical? I said earlier that inclusive design is process-based, not outcome-based, and we don't need to measure progress toward a clearly defined set of outcomes like we do with accessibility. That's the spirit of inclusive design, but good luck selling a process with no outcome to your VP or your CFO. You have to define business outcomes that are aligned with goals they are already pursuing. Fourth, you propose some activities or tactics for how to execute on your big bets, your strategic elements. These are methods your digital product design team can do to take action on your big bets. And that means you need a toolkit, a library of inclusive design methods. And in the workshop, I provide some resources for that. Fifth, you create a strategy document. That's your recipe, your recommendation. It's a hypothesis and an action plan. How you format that document and deliver it should be tailored to what leaders are used to in your organization. And sixth, in the workshop, I have participants write the first draft of their strategy document and give each other feedback. Well, I'm going to stop there, and I just hope that something I said caught your attention, maybe was something you hadn't considered before. If you want links to any of the articles and things I mentioned, this slide deck is at bit.ly/idstrat. And if you don't have a strategic plan for inclusive design, maybe those 6 steps will give you a roadmap to create one. Well, there you have it. Thanks for joining me for UX Questions Special number 1, Inclusive Design Strategy. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking your UX questions at uxquestions.com and subscribe to my video channel or podcast. You can also connect with UX Questions on LinkedIn. And that's all for now. Thank you.